At 5:03 freezing morning, billionaire Elias Ward watched Mara Ellis collect cans beneath his office tower, never imagining that the water-stained Thesis she carried beside her daughter's hand-painted butterfly would expose the secret behind her husband's death, return his forgotten sister's name to the world, and force him to choose between saving his empire and finally doing what was right. Elias Ward arrived at Atlas Meridian Tower before sunrise, as he had every morning for the past 3 months. He was 47, rich enough to sleep anywhere, yet he kept leaving his penthouse before dawn because the silence there had become harder to bear than exhaustion. 3 months earlier, Calvin Rusk, his closest friend and business partner, had vanished with millions of dollars and confidential company records. Calvin had helped build Atlas Meridian from a local carrier into a global transportation empire. He had also shared holidays with Elias and once called him a brother. Now, Elias no longer knew which memories had been real and which had only been part of a plan to betray him. By 4:55 a.m., Elias was alone in his office on the 34th floor. He poured black coffee, opened the latest investigation report, and tried to focus on the hidden accounts and forged approvals. The numbers were large, but they no longer shocked him. What still hurt was knowing that the man he trusted most had watched him talk about loyalty while quietly preparing to disappear. Since Calvin left, Elias had checked every document twice and questioned everyone who entered his office. He called it caution. Deep down, he knew it was fear. At 5:03 a.m., the soft rattle of cans from the street below pulled Elias away from the report. Elias walked to the window and looked down. Beneath a yellow streetlight, a woman in a faded coat stood beside the recycling bins. 3 large bags rested near her feet, and she was sorting aluminum, plastic, and scrap metal into separate piles. She did not search blindly for anything valuable. She checked each item, flattened the cans, and placed them where they belonged. Elias almost returned to his desk. He had seen people collecting cans all over Philadelphia, and his company donated to shelters every year. But there was something different about this woman. Her clothes were worn but clean, and one sleeve had been repaired by hand. She was clearly cold, yet every movement remained steady and purposeful. It looked as though she had planned the route before she arrived. A few minutes later, she found a sealed bottle of water inside a bin. Instead of keeping it, she wiped it clean and placed it on a ledge. An older man pushing a cart soon came around the corner. The woman pointed toward the bottle and said something Elias could not hear. The man took it, drank, and nodded to her. She simply returned to her work, as if the small kindness needed no praise. The moment stayed with Elias. The woman had almost nothing, yet she had noticed someone who had less. No camera recorded it, and no one thanked her publicly. The security guard in the lobby did not even look up. Elias had attended charity dinners where wealthy people applauded one another for writing checks. What he had just seen on the sidewalk felt more honest than any speech at those events. Then the woman did something that made him forget the report completely. She pulled a small notebook from her coat and rested it on the recycling bin. Elias expected her to count the cans or estimate her earnings. Instead, she drew 2 lines across the page, marked several points, and connected them. She checked the time on an old phone, wrote another number, and studied the result. She was drawing a graph. Elias moved closer to the window. His career had been built on patterns, routes, timing, wasted miles, and small delays other people ignored. The woman below was thinking in the same way. She was not wandering through the city and hoping to get lucky. She was measuring, comparing, and improving. Whatever had brought her to that sidewalk, it had not taken away the part of her mind that knew how to build a system. A desperate person grabs whatever can be sold, Elias said softly. But you're not just searching, you're planning. At that moment, the woman's phone rang. She answered quickly, and the hard focus on her face softened. Elias could not hear her words, but he saw her smile and touch 2 fingers to her lips before pressing them to the screen. The call lasted less than a minute, When it ended, she stood still, looking down at the phone. Her smile faded slowly, leaving the expression of someone who had pretended to be fine for the sake of a person she loved. Elias knew that expression. He had worn it many times himself. The woman worked faster after the call. She tied the 3 bags, lifted them with effort, and began walking east. Before leaving, she noticed one last can near the curb, picked it up, flattened it, and placed it in the correct bag. Then she disappeared around the corner. The street looked ordinary again, as if she had never been there. Elias returned to his desk, but he could no longer focus. A few minutes later, he called the security guard and asked whether the woman came often. The guard hesitated before saying he was not sure which woman Elias meant. He had besoin. The woman on the sidewalk stayed in Elias's mind long after she disappeared around the corner. He tried to return to the investigation report, but the numbers blurred together. The way she had worked with such care reminded him of another person who had refused to give up, even when life had already taken too much from her. That person was his older sister, Rose. Elias had spent most of his adult life avoiding memories of her, but some memories did not disappear simply because a man became too busy to face them. They waited quietly until something opened the door. Rose had been 22 when she became pregnant. Elias was 15, young enough to be careless, but old enough to understand how much the baby meant to her. Their mother worked long hours, so Rose had helped raise him for most of his childhood. She made sure he ate before school, attended parent meetings when their mother could not leave work, and stayed awake whenever he came home late. When she learned she was having a girl, she bought a tiny pair of white shoes from a second-hand store. They were too expensive for her budget, but she carried them home like they were the most valuable thing she had ever owned. Rose planned to name the baby Grace. She talked about finding a larger apartment and taking evening classes after the baby was born. Elias often teased her about the list of names taped beside her bed, though Grace had always been the only serious choice. Rose said she wanted her daughter to have a name that sounded like kindness. On the difficult days, she placed the little shoes on her stomach and told the baby that they would walk out of the neighborhood together one day. Elias believed her because Rose had always made impossible things sound simple. One evening, nearly 2 months before her due date, Rose began having severe pain. Their mother was at work, and Elias was the only person home with her. He called for an ambulance while Rose sat on the kitchen floor, holding the edge of the table and trying not to frighten him. The dispatcher asked for their address, then told Elias that emergency units were handling higher priority calls in other parts of the city. He did not understand what that meant. All he knew was that Rose was crying, the minutes were passing, and no one was coming. Elias called again and again. Each time, he was told that help was on the way. 40 minutes later, a neighbor finally drove them toward the hospital in an old sedan that shook whenever it changed lanes. Elias sat in the back seat with Rose's head resting against his chest. She kept asking whether the baby would be all right, and Elias kept saying yes because he could not think of anything else to say. Halfway to the hospital, Rose became very still. Elias called her name, shook her shoulder, and begged her to open her eyes, but she never answered. The doctors tried to save both Rose and the baby. Neither survived. A nurse later handed Elias a plastic bag containing Rose's belongings. Inside were her wallet, a house key, and the tiny white shoes she had brought with her. Elias stood outside the emergency room, holding them in both hands while adults spoke around him in quiet voices. No one explained why the ambulance had taken so long. No one apologized. Rose and Grace became 2 more deaths inside a system that had already moved on to the next emergency. That night, Elias sat alone in the hospital hallway until his mother arrived. She took one look at the shoes and covered her mouth with both hands. Elias had never seen his mother fall apart before. She had survived poverty, illness, and years of working 2 jobs, but the loss of Rose brought her to her knees. Elias stood beside her without knowing how to help. He hated the hospital, the dispatcher, the neighborhood, and most of all, the feeling that his family had not mattered enough for anyone to hurry. Before leaving, Elias placed the shoes inside his jacket and made himself a promise. One day, he would build a transportation system that did not ignore people because of their zip code. He did not know how he would do it, and he had no money, education, or connections. He only knew that no family should have to listen to a loved one ask whether help was coming when the answer depended on where they lived. The promise gave his anger somewhere to go. For years, it became the reason he got out of bed. At 22, Elias bought a damaged delivery truck with borrowed money. He drove during the day, repaired the truck at night, and slept whenever he could. He accepted routes larger companies refused because the neighborhoods were considered difficult or unprofitable. At first, he carried groceries, medicine, furniture, and construction supplies. He remembered every driver, every delay, and every street where transportation failed because someone had decided the people living there were not worth the cost. The company grew quickly. One truck became 5, then 50, then hundreds. Elias created software that reduced delivery times and opened distribution centers in places his competitors had ignored. Investors praised his instincts, and business magazines described him as a man who understood how to move anything, anywhere. Atlas Meridian expanded across the country and later across the world. Elias told himself that every new route brought him closer to the promise he had made to Rose. But somewhere along the way, the promise changed. Elias began measuring success through revenue, market share, and the number of companies he could acquire. Meetings about service became meetings about profit. Routes that did not produce enough money were quietly removed, even when communities depended on them. Elias approved those decisions because executives showed him charts proving they were necessary. He rarely thought about the frightened boy waiting for an ambulance anymore. Calvin Rusk had helped guide that transformation. He was smart, confident, and always knew how to make a difficult choice sound reasonable. Whenever Elias questioned whether Atlas Meridian was losing its purpose, Calvin reminded him that a company had to survive before it could help anyone. Elias accepted that answer because profits kept rising. He did not notice how often survival became an excuse for wanting more. By the time Calvin disappeared, Atlas Meridian had become larger than anything Elias had imagined and farther from its original purpose than he was willing to admit. Elias now owned a penthouse, several homes he rarely visited, private aircraft, expensive art, and more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. His name appeared on hospitals, scholarship programs, and charity foundations. Yet when he woke in the middle of the night, there was no one he felt safe calling. His mother was gone, Rose was gone, and Calvin had turned 20 years of friendship into evidence for a criminal investigation. The people around Elias respected him, feared him, or needed something from him. He no longer knew whether anyone truly knew him. He kept Rose's tiny shoes inside a locked drawer in his penthouse. They had moved with him from apartment to apartment, then from house to house, but he had not opened the box in years. He told himself the shoes belonged to the past. In truth, he was afraid of what they would remind him of. The boy who held them had wanted to save people. The man who owned Atlas Meridian was no longer certain when he had stopped trying. Standing beside the office window, Elias looked down at the corner where the woman had been working. He thought about the graph in her notebook and the care she had taken with every small thing. She had almost nothing, yet her actions still appeared connected to a purpose. Elias had everything, yet much of his life now felt empty. The difference disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. "I thought becoming rich would make me powerful enough to protect everyone," he said quietly. "But money does not remove helplessness. Sometimes it only gives you a better room to hide it in." The office gave him no answer. Outside, the sun began to rise over the city, touching the glass towers first and leaving the sidewalks below in shadow. Elias returned to his desk, but before sitting down, he looked at the clock. He wondered whether the woman would return the next morning. More than that, he wondered why seeing her had brought Rose back to him after all these years. The woman Elias watched from the 34th floor was named Mara Ellis. She was 35 years old and held a master's degree in urban healthcare systems. 2 years earlier, she had not been sorting cans beneath a streetlight. She had been standing before doctors, city officials, and community leaders, explaining how a broken transportation system was costing women their lives. Her thesis was called The Final Route. It focused on pregnant women living in neighborhoods where hospitals were far away and buses were often late. Many of those women missed prenatal visits because they could not afford a taxi, leave work early, or find someone to watch their children. Mara believed people were being blamed for missing care when the real problem was that care had been placed too far beyond their reach. Her plan was simple. Local health workers would stay in contact with pregnant women, volunteer drivers would help with regular appointments, and emergency dispatch centers would share information with nearby clinics. No woman would disappear from the system just because she missed one appointment. Someone would call her. Someone would ask why. Someone would make sure she was not facing the problem alone. Mara knew the issue was bigger than statistics. Her aunt had once traveled across the city on 2 buses while in labor because the closest hospital would not accept her insurance. A neighbor lost a baby after missing several appointments she could not reach without losing her job. People said those women should have asked for help sooner. Mara always wondered why no one asked whether help had ever been close enough to reach. After graduate school, she became the director of a small community health program. The office had old desks, slow computers, and a printer that failed almost every week. The staff was underpaid and always tired, but they believed in the work. Mara wrote grant proposals, trained volunteers, visited families, and answered calls after hours. Within 2 years, the program had helped hundreds of women reach prenatal care on time. Mara remembered many of them by name. She knew which mothers worked night shifts and which ones were afraid of hospitals. She knew who needed an interpreter and who needed someone to sit beside them during an appointment. When a woman did not show up, Mara refused to write "no-show" and forget about her. She called and asked what had happened. During one city funding meeting, a board member asked why taxpayers should pay to transport women who were responsible for reaching their own appointments. Mara looked at him across the table. "A doctor cannot help someone who has no safe way to reach the hospital," she said. "We can keep blaming women for missing care, or we can remove the reason they are missing it." The room fell quiet. The program received funding that afternoon. At home, Mara was not a director or a researcher. She was Jonah's wife and June's mother. Jonah worked as an emergency response coordinator, guiding ambulances through traffic and helping crews find the fastest routes to patients. He understood her work because every night he saw what happened when help arrived too late. Their apartment was small, but it was rarely quiet. Jonah played old music while cooking, even though he only knew how to make a few meals. When he burned dinner, he opened the windows and told June that smoke made food taste more expensive. June laughed every time, even though she knew the joke was coming. Mara often worked at the kitchen table after dinner. Reports and maps covered one side, while June's crayons covered the other. Jonah worried that Mara forgot to eat when she became busy, so he began leaving notes inside her lunch bag. One morning, before an important meeting, Mara found a message written on a folded napkin. "Do not try to save the whole city before breakfast." She laughed when she read it. Then she folded the note and placed it inside her wallet. June was 6 years old and believed her mother could fix almost anything. Broken toys went to Mara. School problems went to Mara. When a bus was late, June said her mother should draw a better route. She described Mara's job as fixing roads people cannot see. One evening, June drew her mother wearing a red superhero cape. Mara held a city map in one hand and a phone in the other. Small ambulances followed blue lines toward houses across the page. Jonah looked at the picture. "Where is Mommy's sword?" he asked. June shook her head. "Mommy doesn't fight people," she said. "She helps them find the way." Jonah placed the drawing on the refrigerator. He told June it was the best picture of Mara anyone had ever made. The family did not have much money. They bought used furniture, delayed repairs, and rarely took vacations. But they ate together whenever Jonah was home. They danced in the kitchen, argued over movies, and made plans for a future they believed was safe. Mara wanted to expand her program across the city. Jonah wanted to train new emergency dispatchers. June wanted a dog large enough to sleep beside her bed. Mara believed education, hard work, and love formed a kind of protection. She had spent years helping families through their worst days. Somewhere inside her, she believed that if her own family ever fell, someone would catch them. She did not yet know how quickly a life could break. She did not know that the woman who once stood at a podium would soon become invisible on a sidewalk. And she did not know that June's drawing of her wearing a cape would one day be folded inside the thesis she carried in a torn bag, because it was one of the last pieces of her old life she could not bear to lose. Rain covered the windshield as Jonah drove toward the emergency dispatch center. He was already running late, but he did not speed. Before leaving home, he had promised Mara he would be careful. June had hugged his leg and made him promise to return before breakfast. Jonah had smiled and told her, "Save me one pancake." At the intersection, the light turned green. Jonah moved forward. A freight truck came from the left without slowing down. The impact pushed his car across 2 lanes and into a traffic pole. The truck belonged to a subcontractor working for Atlas Meridian. Its driver had been on the road for almost 16 hours. Company rules should have forced him to stop hours earlier, but his logbook showed a legal shift. Someone had changed the records before the truck ever reached the intersection. Mara received the call while helping June get ready for bed. The number on the screen belonged to the hospital, but there was no greeting when she answered. "Is this Mara Ellis?" "Yes." "Your husband has been in an accident." Mara stood still with the phone pressed to her ear. June was sitting on the floor, holding one of Jonah's old t-shirts. She looked up and asked why her mother's face had changed. Mara could not answer. She only told June to put on her shoes. Jonah was taken to the same hospital where he had helped coordinate thousands of emergency transports. Nurses who knew his name watched as doctors rushed him into surgery. The man who had spent years sending help to strangers was now surrounded by machines, waiting for someone to save him. The doctors stopped the internal bleeding, but the damage to his brain was severe. Mara sat beside him through the night, holding his hand beneath the wires and tubes. She told him about June's day because she did not know what else to do. She told him that their daughter had lost another tooth, that she had drawn a purple dog at school, and that she was still waiting for the pancake he had promised to eat. A doctor gently warned Mara that Jonah might not be able to hear her. "You don't know him," Mara replied. "He always listens." For 2 days, Mara remained beside the bed. She slept in the chair for a few minutes at a time and woke whenever the machines changed rhythm. She kept expecting Jonah to squeeze her hand or open his eyes. Every small movement gave her hope, even when the nurses explained that it was only a reflex. June was not allowed inside the intensive care unit. She waited with a neighbor in the family room and drew pictures for her father. In one drawing, Jonah stood beside an ambulance with his arms open. Above him, June had written, "Come home soon, Daddy." Mara taped the picture beside his bed. On the 3rd morning, the doctors asked her to sit down. The swelling in Jonah's brain had continued to worsen. There was no meaningful brain activity and no chance that he would wake again. The machines were keeping his body alive, but the man Mara loved was already gone. She asked the doctors to give her 1 more hour. Mara called June and asked her to send a voice message for her father. June did not understand why she could not speak to him directly. Mara said the hospital equipment was too loud and that Daddy needed to rest. June began the recording with a serious voice. "Hi, Daddy. Mommy says you're sleeping. I saved your pancake, but she put it in the refrigerator because it got cold." Then the little girl laughed. It was the same bright laugh that used to fill their kitchen whenever Jonah burned dinner or danced badly to an old song. Mara played the recording again and again. She placed Jonah's headphones against his chest and turned the volume up just enough for the sound to fill the room. When the medical team entered, Mara leaned close to him. She rested her forehead against his and tried to speak without crying. "You spent your life helping people find their way home," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't bring you back to us." The machines were turned off one by one. Mara kept one hand around Jonah's fingers and the other against the headphones. The monitor slowed, then became silent. June's laughter continued for several seconds after Jonah's heart stopped. Mara did not let go. For the rest of her life, she would remember that sound, the silence of the machine and her daughter laughing beside it, too young to know she had just said goodbye. 3 days after Jonah died, the first hospital bill arrived. Mara had not yet put away the clothes he had worn on his final morning, but the envelope was already waiting in the mailbox. More bills followed: surgery, intensive care, ambulance service, funeral costs, and loans she had forgotten they still owed. Each envelope used polite words such as balance, payment, and responsibility. None of them mentioned that Jonah had died. Together, the numbers were larger than everything Mara and Jonah had saved during 10 years of marriage. Mara called the hospital's financial assistance office. The first person transferred her to billing. Billing sent her to patient services, and patient services gave her another number to call. Every department asked her to explain Jonah's death again. Each time, she had to repeat his name, the date of the accident, and the moment the machines were turned off. One employee told her to complete a 20-page application and wait 6 to 8 weeks. When Mara said she might lose her apartment before then, the woman quietly replied, "I'm sorry, but that's the process." Mara filled out every form. She sent bank records, pay stubs, Jonah's death certificate, and proof that she had a 6-year-old daughter. 2 weeks later, the hospital asked for documents she had already submitted. She called again and waited on hold for nearly an hour while June sat beside her drawing pictures. When someone finally answered, Mara was told that her case had been closed because one page was missing. She looked down at the papers spread across the kitchen table and felt as though her entire life had been reduced to boxes someone could mark incomplete. While Jonah had been in the hospital, Mara's nonprofit lost its largest grant. She learned about it in an email asking her to attend a meeting with her supervisor. She arrived wearing the same black dress she had worn to Jonah's funeral because she had not had the strength to choose anything else. Her supervisor, Daniel, kept his hands folded on the desk and avoided looking directly at her. He explained that several positions were being eliminated and that Mara's role was one of them. "No one doubts your ability," he said. "We just don't have the budget to wait for you to recover." Mara stared at him. She had written the grants that kept the program alive, trained most of the staff, and answered emergency calls long after her workday ended. She had missed 11 days because her husband was dying. Now the place she had helped build was treating those 11 days as proof that it could continue without her. "I never asked you to wait for me to recover," she said. "I asked you not to erase me from something I helped create." Daniel said he had fought for her position. He said the decision had come from the board and that there was nothing more he could do. Mara received 2 weeks of severance and a cardboard box containing her framed degree, a coffee mug, and June's drawing of her wearing a red cape. As she carried the box through the hallway, several co-workers looked down at their desks. One woman began to cry but did not stand up to hug her. Without Mara's salary, the rent quickly fell behind. Jonah's final paycheck covered groceries and part of the funeral. Their savings disappeared into medical payments because Mara still believed paying something would stop the calls. It did not. Collection agencies began contacting her before breakfast and after dinner. June learned to stop asking why the phone rang so often. Whenever Mara answered, the little girl became quiet and watched her mother's face. The eviction notice arrived 10 days after Mara lost her job. She read it twice before sitting on the kitchen floor. June found her there and asked whether she was sick. Mara pulled her daughter close and said they would have to leave the apartment for a while. June looked toward her bedroom and asked whether she could bring all her stuffed animals. Mara said there would not be enough room. They packed what they could into Jonah's old car. Mara took clothes, school supplies, important documents, and the thesis she had spent years writing. June chose one stuffed rabbit and the drawing of her mother in the cape. Before leaving, Mara stood in the kitchen where Jonah used to dance while cooking. His last note was still attached to the refrigerator with a magnet. She placed it inside her wallet, turned off the lights, and closed the door. The first shelter Mara called was full. The second had no beds for families, and the third told her to try again the following week. By evening, rain had begun falling, and June was hungry. Mara bought her a sandwich from a gas station and said they were going on an urban camping adventure. She tried to sound excited. June smiled because she understood that her mother needed her to. That night, Mara parked beneath a streetlight near a 24-hour grocery store. She lowered the back seat and made a bed for June using 2 blankets and Jonah's old sweatshirt. June asked whether Daddy had ever gone camping in a car. Mara said he probably would have complained about the lack of pancakes. June laughed softly, then turned toward the window so her mother would not see her face. Around midnight, the temperature dropped. Mara woke and saw June curled tightly beneath the blankets. The little girl's eyes were slightly open, but she remained still and pretended to sleep. Mara understood that June was cold and did not want to worry her. That realization hurt more than any bill or eviction notice. Mara removed her coat and placed it over her daughter. She tucked the sleeves around June's shoulders and sat in the driver's seat with her arms folded across her chest. The cold entered through the windows and settled into her hands, but she did not take the coat back. Through the rearview mirror, she watched until June finally fell asleep. Mara remained awake until morning. 10 days earlier, she had been a wife, a program director, and a woman with a home. Now, she was sitting inside her dead husband's car, trying to keep their daughter warm without letting her know how afraid she was. For the first time, Mara understood that losing everything did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened through one bill, one closed door, and one person saying there was nothing they could do. For the next 6 months, Mara applied for every job she could find. She applied to hospitals, community clinics, nonprofit organizations, and city programs. She even applied for office jobs that paid far less than her old position. Most employers never replied. The few who interviewed her became uncomfortable when she explained the gap in her resume. They praised her experience, promised to call, and then disappeared. Mara could not wait for someone to decide she was worth hiring. June needed food, bus fare, and clean clothes. The shelter provided a bed, but families had to leave during most of the day. Mara began collecting aluminum cans because it was one of the few ways she could earn money immediately. The work paid very little, but no one asked about her address, her husband, or the worst year of her life. At first, Mara walked without a plan and collected whatever she found. After several days, she realized some streets produced far more cans than others. Office blocks were best before sanitation trucks arrived. College areas were better after lunch, while restaurant alleys filled up late in the evening. Mara began recording everything. She could not control what had happened to her, but she could still study a problem. Within 3 weeks, she had created 6 collection routes across the city. She recorded what time each bin was emptied, how many cans she found on each block, and how far she had to carry them to the recycling center. She compared rainy days with dry days and weekdays with weekends. If one route took too long and paid too little, she changed it. The same mind that had once designed healthcare programs was now being used to earn enough money for dinner. Mara kept the information in an unfinished school notebook that belonged to June. There were still math problems and spelling words on the first few pages. Mara had planned to tear them out, but when she opened the notebook, she found a sentence written in June's uneven handwriting. "Mommy will have a desk again." Mara sat on the edge of her shelter bed and read the sentence several times. She did not know when June had written it. Perhaps it had been before the eviction, when Mara still worked late at the kitchen table. Perhaps June had written it after they began sleeping in the car. Mara could not ask without crying, so she left the page exactly where it was. Every day, Mara wrote her routes beneath that sentence, the notebook filled with times, distances, weights, and small totals. On a good day, she earned enough to buy groceries and save a few dollars. On a bad day, the money barely covered bus fare. No matter how carefully she planned, the numbers never reached enough for rent. Still, she kept writing because a plan made the future feel slightly less frightening. June sometimes helped Mara sort cans near the shelter. Mara hated letting her daughter see the work, but June treated it like an important job. She separated aluminum from plastic and reminded her mother not to forget any bags. One afternoon, she found a can that had not been crushed. It was clean, smooth, and almost perfect. June washed it in the shelter bathroom and carried it back to their room. She borrowed blue paint from the children's activity table and covered the side with a large butterfly. The wings were uneven and paint ran down one edge, but June held it proudly. "This one is not for selling," she said. Mara smiled. "Why not?" "Because it's for your desk." Mara looked at the can, then at her daughter. "I don't have a desk anymore." "You will," June said. "Put it there when you get one. Then you'll remember how to come home to me." Mara tried to answer, but her voice would not come. She pulled June into her arms and held her tightly. The little girl believed there was still a desk waiting somewhere in their future. Mara wanted to believe it too, even if only for that moment. From then on, Mara carried the butterfly can inside her bag. It weighed almost nothing, but she protected it more carefully than anything she collected. On difficult days, she looked at it before selling the rest of the cans. It reminded her that June did not see a homeless woman searching through trash. She still saw her mother, the woman who fixed invisible roads and always found a way forward. Mara's 6 routes did not lead them out of the shelter. The money was never enough, and each day left her more exhausted than the last. But the notebook gave her a reason to keep moving, and the butterfly can gave her something numbers could not. It gave her a small piece of tomorrow. The next morning, Elias arrived at the office before 5. He told himself it was because of the investigation into Calvin, but the report on his desk remained unopened. He stood beside the window and watched the corner below. At 5:06, Mara appeared with her 3 bags and the old notebook in her coat pocket. Elias felt an unexpected sense of relief. He had been afraid she would not return. Mara followed the same route as before. She checked each bin, separated the cans, and wrote down her results. When she found food that was still sealed, she placed it on the ledge for someone else. She worked until the bags were heavy, then disappeared around the corner. Elias watched the empty sidewalk for several minutes before returning to his desk. He still did not know her name, but he had begun to recognize the way she moved. On the second morning, an elderly man approached her. His clothes were worn, and he pushed a shopping cart filled with blankets and empty bottles. He spoke to Mara for a long time, pointing toward his chest and then down the street. Mara stopped working and listened carefully. She pulled out her notebook, wrote an address on a piece of paper, and drew a simple map. The man looked confused. Mara pointed toward the next intersection, then raised 3 fingers. She repeated the directions until he nodded. Before he left, she placed the paper inside his coat pocket so he would not lose it. Elias later asked one of his assistants to find out what was located 3 blocks away. It was a free clinic that treated patients without insurance. The elderly man's name was Samuel Price. Years earlier, he had worked as an emergency medical technician. He had spent most of his life helping strangers during their worst moments. After his wife died and his memory began to fail, he lost his job, then his apartment. Some days, he forgot where he had slept the night before. Other days, he could still remember the names of patients he had carried into ambulances 20 years earlier. Samuel often forgot Mara's name, but he never forgot her face. Whenever he saw her, he smiled and called her the map teacher. "You always know where people need to go," he told her. Mara never corrected him. She only asked whether he had eaten and whether he had taken his medicine. To Samuel, those questions mattered more than remembering her name. On the third morning, the temperature dropped below freezing. Elias saw Mara rubbing her hands together between bins. She wore a thin pair of black gloves with a hole near one thumb. A young woman appeared at the corner, carrying a baby beneath her coat. She looked frightened and kept checking behind her. Mara spoke to her, then pointed toward a women's shelter several blocks away. The young mother shook so badly that she nearly dropped the paper Mara gave her. Without hesitation, Mara removed her gloves and placed them in the woman's hands. The woman tried to refuse, but Mara closed her fingers around them. Then she helped pull the coat tighter around the baby. Mara returned to the recycling bins with bare hands. The cold metal must have hurt, but she continued working. Elias looked down at his own hands wrapped around a warm coffee cup. He owned a company with thousands of employees and a foundation that donated millions each year. Yet Mara, who was collecting cans to survive, had given away the only thing keeping her hands warm. The moment stayed with him through every meeting that day. On the fourth morning, Elias began to notice smaller details. Mara always checked the time before changing streets. She avoided bins that other collectors had already searched. She left certain bottles untouched because they were worth too little to carry. Once, she stopped to tighten the wheel on Samuel's shopping cart using a coin. Another time, she gave him half of a sandwich and pretended she had already eaten. Elias was no longer watching because he found her unusual. He was watching because he wanted to understand her. She had the habits of someone trained to solve problems, yet she lived on whatever the city threw away. She treated strangers with care, even though the world had not treated her kindly. Every morning gave him another question, and he had no answer to any of them. On the fifth morning, Elias did not take the elevator upstairs. His driver stopped in front of the building, but Elias remained in the car. It had rained during the night, and the sidewalk shone beneath the streetlights. He told the driver to leave and walked across the street. For the first time, he stood at the same level as the woman he had been watching from above. He waited in the shadow of a closed coffee shop. From there, he could hear the sound of cans moving inside the bags and the quiet scrape of Mara's shoes against the wet pavement. She arrived at 5:04 and began working without looking around. At street level, Elias could see how tired she was. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, and her coat was thinner than it had appeared from the 34th floor. Still, her movements remained careful. She checked each item, recorded the number in her notebook, and moved to the next bin. Elias wondered how long she had been doing this and what waited for her when the route was finished. He wanted to speak to her, but he did not know what he could say without sounding like a wealthy stranger trying to feel better about himself. Mara reached into the final bin and pulled at a can caught beneath a piece of cardboard. One of her bags slipped from her shoulder. The strap caught on a sharp corner of the metal container. She tried to free it, but the weight pulled the fabric tighter. The bag tore open. Cans rolled across the wet sidewalk. Plastic bottles bounced into the street. Several papers slipped from the bottom of the bag and scattered in the wind. Mara dropped to her knees. She did not reach for the cans. She reached for a bound document sliding toward a puddle. The torn bag opened all at once. Aluminum cans rolled toward the curb. Plastic bottles bounced across the wet sidewalk, and several sheets of paper lifted into the wind. Mara dropped to her knees before the last can had stopped moving. She ignored the things she could sell and reached for a bound document lying partly inside a puddle. She pulled it against her chest and wiped the water from its cover with both hands. For a moment, she looked less like a woman protecting a stack of paper and more like someone trying to save the last piece of a life that had already been taken from her. Two loose pages blew toward the street. Elias stepped from the shadow of the coffee shop and caught one beneath his shoe before a passing car could run over it. He picked up the second page near the curb, then crossed toward Mara. She looked up sharply when she noticed him. Her fear was immediate. Elias stopped several feet away and held out the pages without moving any closer. "These belong to you," he said. Mara reached for them quickly. Before her hand closed around the paper, Elias saw the title printed across the front page. The Final Route: Reducing Maternal Mortality Through Community Medical Transportation Networks. Beneath the title was a name: Mara Ellis, Master of Urban Healthcare Systems. Elias read it twice. The woman he had watched sorting cans before sunrise had written a graduate thesis about transportation and healthcare. It explained the notebook, the routes, and the way she studied every block. She was using the same skills to survive that she had once used to help other people reach hospitals. A smaller sheet slipped from between the pages and landed near Elias's hand. It was not part of the thesis. It was a child's drawing made with crayons. A woman stood inside a large office wearing a red cape. A city map covered one wall, and a bright blue road led from the office to a small house. At the bottom, a child had written, "Mommy's New Desk." Mara saw the drawing and pulled it from the ground so quickly that the paper nearly tore. She checked the corners, then placed it deep inside the thesis. Her hands were shaking. The cans continued rolling around them, but she did not look at them. Elias held out the final page. "You wrote this?" Mara took it from him. "Someone I used to be wrote it." "You're still that person." She gave him a tired look. "You don't know who I am. I know this is serious work. You saw one page. I saw enough to know it mattered to you." Mara wiped mud from the clear cover with her sleeve. The water had spread into the first few pages, and she pressed them flat with her palm. Her face tightened as she saw the damage. Elias bent to help gather the remaining papers, but Mara moved between him and the document. "Please don't," she said. "I'm only trying to help." That's what people say before they decide what kind of help I should be grateful for. Elias straightened. He had spent his life giving orders and expecting people to listen. Now he realized that even standing too close made Mara feel cornered. He stepped back and pointed toward the cans scattered across the sidewalk. "Then tell me what you need." "I need to finish before the sanitation truck gets here." She began placing the pages back inside the damaged binder. Elias watched her try to hide the child's drawing between the research notes. Something about it stayed with him. The girl in the picture had not drawn Mara carrying bags or kneeling beside a recycling bin. She had drawn her mother behind a desk, leading people toward safety. Elias looked again at the title. "A transportation network for pregnant women?" Mara stopped moving. "My company works in transportation," he continued. "I understand what a project like this takes." Mara looked up at the tower behind him. The Atlas Meridian name glowed above the entrance. Then she looked at his coat, his shoes, and the watch on his wrist. She understood who he was, or at least what kind of man he was. "People in buildings like that understand delivery schedules," she said. "They don't understand what happens when help never reaches your street." The words struck Elias harder than she could have known. "My sister died waiting for an ambulance," he said. Mara's expression changed for only a second. The anger did not disappear, but something softer passed through it. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I." They stood in silence while a bus moved through the intersection. A can rolled beneath it and was crushed under the tire. Mara watched it disappear, then tightened her grip on the thesis. Elias nodded toward the document. "Your work didn't become worthless because your life changed." Mara looked at the torn bag at her feet. "That's easy to believe when your past is framed on an office wall." She lifted the thesis. "Try carrying yours in a garbage bag for a year. Try protecting it from rain while deciding whether the paper is worth more than the food you could buy by selling everything else. Then tell me it still belongs to you." Elias had no answer. Mara placed the thesis inside the remaining bag, careful to keep it away from the wet cans. She gathered what she could, but several had rolled too far into the street. Elias bent and picked up the ones near him. When he offered them to her, she hesitated before taking them. "Thank you," she said quietly. It was not warm, but it was honest. She tied the torn side of the bag into a rough knot and lifted it onto her shoulder. The weight pulled her body to one side. Elias wanted to ask her name, even though he had already read it. He wanted to ask where she had studied, what had happened to her, and who the child in the drawing was. He knew that asking any of those questions now would only make her leave faster. "Mara," he said before he could stop himself. She froze. He immediately regretted using her name. It made clear that he had read more than she wanted him to see. Mara turned toward him. "Forget it. I don't think I can. That isn't my problem." She walked away without looking back. The damaged bag struck against her leg, and the thesis remained pressed close to her side. Elias stayed on the sidewalk among the cans she had been forced to leave behind. For 5 mornings, he had wondered what kind of woman created charts while collecting recycling. Now he knew her name. What he did not know was how someone capable of designing a system to save lives had ended up fighting to protect her work from a puddle. Elias returned to his office with Mara's name still in his mind. He ignored the investigation report on his desk and searched for her online. Within seconds, he found university awards, city health reports, and articles describing her as one of Philadelphia's most promising community health leaders. He opened an old recording from a city council meeting. Mara stood beside a large transportation map in a dark blue suit. She looked calm and prepared as officials questioned whether transportation should be treated as part of health care. Mara explained that medical care was useless when patients had no safe way to reach it. No woman, she said, should lose her life simply because an ambulance considered her neighborhood too far away or unimportant. Elias paused the video. The confident woman on the screen was the same woman who had knelt in rainwater less than an hour earlier, trying to save her thesis from a puddle. On the screen, people listened when she spoke. On the sidewalk, most people had not even looked at her. He continued reading. Mara had helped create a transportation network connecting pregnant women with clinics, volunteer drivers, and emergency services. When the program nearly lost its funding, she had returned to City Hall and fought to keep it alive. Hundreds of families had received care because she refused to let officials reduce them to numbers. Elias turned toward the window. A few cans still lay near the curb where Mara's bag had torn. His office stood high above the street, filled with expensive furniture and wide glass walls. For years, the view had made him feel successful. Now, it only reminded him how easy it was to look down on a city without truly seeing the people below. He had once believed that those at the top understood more because they could see farther. Yet Mara had been directly beneath his window, carrying knowledge that could save lives, and no one inside the tower had known her name. Another article mentioned that Mara had left her position after the death of her husband, Jonah Ellis. Jonah had worked as an emergency response coordinator and died after a freight truck ran a red light during heavy rain. Elias read the report carefully. It mentioned driver fatigue and possible safety violations, but the trucking company's name was missing. One paragraph appeared to have been edited. An older search result still showed part of a company name, but the full article referred only to an unnamed regional contractor. That detail disturbed him. Companies did not disappear from public accident reports without help. Someone had pressured the newspaper, threatened legal action, or used enough money to make the name vanish. Elias searched several other reports and found the same omission in everyone. He called the head of corporate security and requested the original records connected to Jonah's accident. He did not yet know whether Atlas Meridian was involved, but he knew someone had worked hard to hide the truth. After the call, Elias returned to the paused video. Mara stood beside the map with one hand raised, explaining how a better route might save a mother and her child. Outside his window, the sidewalk was empty. At first, Elias had wanted to understand how a woman like Mara had ended up collecting cans. Now, he was afraid that the answer might lead back to his own company. The following morning, Elias arrived before Mara. He stood beside the recycling bins with 2 cups of coffee in his hands, feeling strangely uncertain. He had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars without needing to rehearse a sentence, yet he had spent most of the drive downtown wondering what he could say to a woman who had already made it clear that she did not want to be rescued. At 5:08, Mara appeared at the corner with 3 bags over her shoulders. The moment she saw him, she stopped. Her eyes moved from his expensive coat to the coffee, then toward the glass tower behind him. Everything about her expression told Elias that she was preparing to leave. "I brought you coffee," Elias said. "That's all." Mara did not reach for the cup. Months earlier, a charity had invited families from her shelter to a free meal. She had gone because June had eaten little more than crackers that day. While Mara stood in line holding her daughter's hand, a volunteer took their photograph without asking. The picture later appeared online beneath a fundraising message asking people to help families with nowhere to go. The campaign received thousands of dollars and hundreds of supportive comments, but no one ever contacted Mara or June again. Mara had learned that some people were willing to use her pain as long as they did not have to know her name. She looked directly at Elias. "Do you want to help me, or do you want other people to watch you helping me?" The question caught him off guard, but he did not defend himself. "I do not yet know how to help." "Then begin by refusing to turn me into a story that makes you feel generous." Elias lowered the cup. Mara's voice was controlled, but he could hear the anger beneath it. It was not anger created by one bad morning. It came from months of being examined, judged, photographed, and then forgotten. She had been asked to explain her homelessness more often than anyone had asked about the work she once did. Strangers wanted to know how she had fallen because her suffering made an interesting story. Few of them wanted to know what she might still be capable of building. "I am not asking for your story," Elias said. "I want to understand your work." Mara glanced at the tower again. "Men like you usually want to hear about suffering. Our abilities rarely make them curious." "I read about the transportation network in your thesis. You connected health workers, volunteer drivers, clinics, and dispatch centers. That wasn't a classroom exercise. You designed something that could actually work." For the first time, Mara did not immediately turn away. Most people who learned about her degree reacted with surprise, as though education and homelessness could not exist in the same person. They asked why she had not made better choices or why she could not simply find another job. Elias was the first person in a long time who had spoken about the structure of her research instead of treating her life like a warning. Still, she did not trust him. "You read a title and searched my name. That doesn't mean you understand what I built." "No," Elias admitted. "It means I know enough to ask you instead of pretending I already have the answer." Mara studied his face, looking for the performance behind the words. Elias did not move closer. He did not offer money, ask where she slept, or demand an explanation for how she had ended up there. He simply stood in the cold, holding 2 cups of coffee, while the city slowly woke around them. "I have to work," Mara said. "The sanitation truck will be here soon." Elias nodded. He placed 1 cup on the stone ledge near the entrance. "Then I won't take any more of your time." He entered the tower without asking her to accept the coffee. From the 34th floor, he watched Mara continue her route. She separated the cans, recorded the numbers in June's notebook, and moved steadily from one bin to the next. The cup remained on the ledge. Elias returned to his desk twice, but each time he found himself walking back toward the window. At 5:31, Mara tied the last bag and lifted it onto her shoulder. She walked toward the corner, passing the coffee without touching it. Elias felt disappointed. though he knew he had no right to expect anything from her. Then Mara stopped. She looked at the cup, glanced toward the empty sidewalk, and slowly returned to the ledge. She picked it up with both hands. The heat had almost disappeared, but the cup was still warmer than her fingers. Mara took one small sip, held it for another moment, and placed it back exactly where Elias had left it. Then she lifted her bags and walked away. From the window, Elias watched until she disappeared around the corner. He understood that the sip did not mean she trusted him. It did not mean she had accepted his help or forgiven him for entering a part of her life she had tried to protect. It meant only that for a few seconds she had allowed herself to receive something without being photographed, questioned, or asked to show gratitude. It was not trust, but the door had not completely closed. Mara did not return the next morning. Elias arrived before 5 with 2 cups of coffee, but the corner remained empty. He waited until the sanitation truck came and cleared the bins. By then, 1 cup had gone cold in his hand, and the other sat untouched on the ledge. He told himself Mara had probably changed routes or needed a day away. Still, her absence felt personal, as though he had pushed too hard and frightened her away. Back in his office, Elias opened the digital copy of the final route. Until then, he had only read the summary, several research sections, and the pages he had found online. That morning, he began with the title page and read every word. Mara had studied neighborhoods where pregnant women often missed medical appointments because buses were unreliable and ambulances took too long to arrive. She had interviewed mothers, nurses, dispatchers, and retired emergency workers. Behind every number was a woman who had waited for help while someone in an office decided her street was too far away. The thesis was serious, but it never felt cold. Mara wrote about response times and transportation routes, yet she always returned to the people affected by them. One mother had walked more than a mile while in labor because no car would stop for her. Another had missed 4 appointments because her employer threatened to fire her if she left early. Mara did not describe them as irresponsible patients. She showed how the system had made care almost impossible to reach. Elias read for hours. He ignored calls from the board and postponed 2 meetings. The deeper he went into the research, the more clearly he understood why Mara had protected the thesis when her bag tore. It was not only proof of her education, it held years of work, the voices of families who had trusted her, and the person she had been before her life fell apart. Near the end, Elias reached the dedication. The first lines thanked Mara's professors, community workers, Jonah and June. Then he saw a name that made him stop breathing. Rose Ward. Mara had dedicated part of the thesis to a 22-year-old pregnant woman from West Philadelphia who died after waiting too long for emergency transportation. The woman had gone into premature labor while her teenage brother called repeatedly for an ambulance. The nearest available unit had been redirected to a neighborhood with a higher priority rating. A neighbor eventually drove her toward the hospital, but both the mother and baby died before doctors could save them. Elias read the paragraph again. The age was correct. The neighborhood was correct. Even the detail about the neighbor's old car was there. Mara had written that Rose's baby was going to be named Grace. Elias had never seen that detail in any public report. His hands began to shake. For decades, Rose had existed in official records as an unidentified patient number. Her file contained dates, times, and medical codes, but almost nothing about who she had been. It did not say that she sang while washing dishes or that she raised her younger brother while their mother worked nights. It did not mention the tiny white shoes she had bought for her daughter. The system had recorded the death and forgotten the person. Mara had found Rose's story during an interview with a retired midwife. The woman had remembered the frightened boy sitting outside the emergency room with the baby shoes in his hands. She remembered Rose's name because she had stayed with the family after the doctors left. Mara had placed that memory in her thesis so Rose would not remain only a number. Elias touched the line on the screen. "You did not disappear, Rose. A stranger remembered your name while your own brother spent years using money to run away from it." His voice broke near the end. He leaned back and covered his eyes, but the tears came anyway. He had not cried for Rose since he was 15. He had spent years turning grief into work, then work into money, and money into walls. He had built an empire because he believed success could make the past smaller. Instead, a woman collecting cans had carried his sister's name through the years when he could barely bring himself to speak it. For a long time, Elias sat alone. Then he returned to the thesis and continued reading. He felt he owed Mara that much. He owed Rose more. In the appendix, Mara examined why some neighborhoods experienced longer emergency response times. One section focused on exclusive transportation contracts between cities and private companies. These contracts often reduced competition and gave a single provider control over routes, staffing, and vehicle placement. When the provider cut costs, poor neighborhoods were usually the first to lose coverage. A company name appeared in one of the tables: Northline Transit Services. Elias knew it immediately. Northline had been one of Atlas Meridian's earliest acquisitions. He had purchased the company years ago because it controlled several valuable city contracts. At the time, Calvin had handled the review and assured Elias that the company's safety problems had been minor and resolved. Mara's research told a different story. During the years Northline controlled emergency transportation in several poor neighborhoods, response times had increased. Vehicles were often moved toward wealthier districts because those contracts paid more. Rose's neighborhood had been one of the areas left with fewer ambulances. Elias stared at the company name. He had always believed Atlas Meridian was built because of what happened to Rose. But one of the businesses inside his empire had once been part of the same kind of system that abandoned her. He opened the acquisition records and searched for the original safety review. Several documents were missing. Others carried Calvin's approval. Elias felt the same cold fear he had experienced when he discovered the stolen accounts, but this was worse. Money could be returned. A life could not. Outside the window, the corner where Mara usually worked remained empty. Elias looked at the thesis, then at the old company files on his screen. Mara had returned Rose's name to him. Without knowing it, she had also placed a question in front of him that he could no longer avoid. How many other names had been buried beneath the success of Atlas Meridian? Elias ordered a private internal review of Jonah Ellis's accident before sunrise. He limited the investigation to 3 people he still trusted and told them not to use the company's normal reporting system. If Calvin had hidden the truth once, Elias did not want anyone connected to him learning that the old files had been reopened. By noon, the first records arrived. The freight truck that struck Jonah's car had belonged to Red Harbor Logistics, a subcontractor operating under Atlas Meridian. Calvin Rusk had personally approved the contract and supervised its safety reviews. The official records claimed the truck driver had worked fewer than 9 hours that day. Fuel receipts, toll camera footage, and warehouse entry logs told a different story. He had been driving for almost 16 hours with only 2 short stops. 3 weeks before the crash, another driver had warned management that employees were being pressured to continue working after reaching their legal limits. That report had disappeared from the company database. A second warning had been marked resolved, though no investigation had ever taken place. Elias studied the documents at his desk until the words began to blur. Several driver signatures were identical, copied onto different forms. A safety manager who had supposedly approved the schedules had been on medical leave at the time. Someone had forged his name. The records had not been changed after the accident to cover one mistake. They had been falsified for months so the company could deliver more freight with fewer drivers. The arrangement had increased profits. Elias remembered the quarterly report from that year. Calvin had entered the boardroom smiling and announced that contractor efficiency had reached a company record. Elias had congratulated him in front of the entire board. He had seen faster delivery times and lower labor costs, but he had never asked what those numbers required from the people behind the wheel. The final document was an email sent 2 days after Jonah's death. A Red Harbor executive warned Calvin that the driver's real hours could expose both companies to criminal investigation. Calvin replied with only one sentence: "Handle the records before legal sees them." The following week, Atlas Meridian's legal department received a clean logbook and a report blaming the crash on rain and driver error. Calvin had not merely ignored the danger, he had hidden it. Elias looked toward the window, but he did not see the city. He saw Mara in the hospital beside Jonah. He saw June waiting for a father who had promised to return for breakfast. He saw the woman on the sidewalk protecting her thesis from the rain, while the company responsible for her loss continued earning money. Atlas Meridian had not only failed to prevent a transportation tragedy, it had helped create one. Elias had never ordered anyone to change a logbook. He had never told drivers to work until they could barely keep their eyes open. Yet Calvin had acted with authority Elias had given him. Every false report had survived because the profits looked good, and Elias had trusted the man presenting them. He had built Atlas Meridian after losing Rose, believing transportation could save families from the pain his own family had suffered. Somewhere along the way, the company had become part of the same system he once wanted to fight. His attorneys arrived that evening. They closed the office door and placed the documents in a locked folder. The lead attorney explained that the evidence was serious but incomplete. Calvin was gone. Red Harbor had already dissolved, and most of the employees involved no longer worked for the company. If Atlas Meridian reported the findings immediately, the company could face lawsuits, criminal investigations, canceled contracts, and thousands of layoffs. The attorney advised Elias to keep the review confidential until they knew how much could be proven. "You did not cause that accident," he said. Elias looked at Calvin's email on the screen. "My signature allowed the system that caused it to survive. You had no knowledge of the falsified reports. I had knowledge of the profits. That is not the same thing. It was enough for me to celebrate the result without asking how it happened." The attorney stood and walked toward the window. He had worked with Elias for more than a decade and had never seen him willing to risk the company over an incident he had not personally ordered. He reminded Elias that Atlas Meridian employed thousands of people who had done nothing wrong. An immediate confession could damage their lives as well. Admitting this could cost you the company. Elias thought of the tiny shoes Rose never got to place on her child's feet. He thought of Jonah's photograph beside an ambulance and June's drawing hidden inside Mara's thesis. For years, he had told himself that protecting the company meant protecting the people who depended on it. Now, he understood how easily that belief could become an excuse to hide the truth. If the company can only survive by burying the dead a second time, it does not deserve to be saved. No one in the room spoke. Elias ordered the legal team to preserve every record connected to Red Harbor, Calvin, and the accident. No files were to be deleted, altered, or removed. An outside firm would review the evidence, and the findings would be given to investigators. He knew the board would fight him. Investors would accuse him of destroying value, and people who once praised his leadership would call him reckless. But for the first time in years, Elias was not thinking about what Atlas Meridian might lose. He was thinking about what Mara had already lost because men like him had protected the wrong things. Mara did not return to the corner outside Atlas Meridian Tower. She changed all 6 of her collection routes and avoided the streets near Elias's office. The new routes paid less and took longer, but distance felt safer. She had spent months learning how quickly kindness could become curiosity and how easily curiosity could turn into control. Elias knew her name, had seen her thesis, and had looked at the part of her life she worked hardest to protect. Mara feared that the next time she saw him, he would arrive with reporters, a company lawyer, or an offer that required her gratitude. That evening, she sat on the edge of her bed at the family shelter. June was asleep beside her, one arm wrapped around a worn, stuffed rabbit. Around them, other families were settling in for the night. A baby cried behind a thin wall. Someone coughed in the hallway. The heating system made a low rattling sound, but never warmed the room completely. Across from Mara sat Ruth Bennett, a retired elementary school teacher who had lived in the shelter for nearly 3 years. A stroke had ended her career, and medical bills had taken the apartment where she had lived for more than 2 decades. Ruth walked with a cane and spoke with the calm voice of someone who had spent years waiting for children to tell the truth. She noticed Mara staring at the same page in her notebook without writing anything. "You changed your route again," Ruth said. Mara closed the notebook. She had not planned to tell anyone, but the words came out slowly. She told Ruth about the man in the expensive coat, the coffee he had offered, and the way he had seen the title of her thesis when the bag tore. She explained that Elias had searched for her online and wanted to talk about her research. Ruth listened without interrupting. Mara also told her about the charity photograph and the employers who had praised her qualifications before quietly rejecting her. She admitted that Elias had spoken about her work instead of asking how she became homeless. That difference frightened her almost as much as it interested her. When Mara finished, Ruth folded her hands over the top of her cane. "You do not need to trust that man. You only need to trust that your ability still exists." Mara looked toward June. "Every time I opened a door for someone, they took something from me." Ruth nodded. "Then do not open the entire door this time. Open it only wide enough to see whether there is truly a cliff on the other side." Mara wanted to dismiss the advice. Trust was easy to recommend when someone else would pay the price for being wrong. If Elias humiliated her, Ruth would comfort her. But if he threatened the small stability Mara had built, June would suffer. Mara could not risk another shelter posting their photograph or another employer learning where they slept. "I don't have room for another mistake," Mara said. "Not with June depending on me." Ruth's expression softened. "This shelter keeps children warm. It gives them food and a place to sleep, but it cannot become the whole future you choose for her." The words hurt because Mara had already thought them. June had changed schools twice. She kept most of her belongings in one plastic box. At night, she sometimes asked whether they would still be living there when she turned 7. Mara always gave the same answer. Not for long. She no longer knew whether she believed it. Ruth reached for Mara's notebook and opened it to the first page. June's uneven handwriting was still there. "Mommy will have a desk again." "You keep planning routes that earn $30 instead of 26, Ruth said. "That proves you have not stopped thinking like the woman who wrote that thesis. But these numbers will not take you where you want to go." Mara looked at the pages filled with collection times, weights, and payments. She had improved every route she could. She worked longer, carried heavier bags, and skipped meals to save money. Still, rent remained out of reach. The plan kept them alive, but it was not leading them home. Ruth returned the notebook. "Maybe that man is lying. Maybe he only wants to feel important. You are allowed to walk away if you discover that. But fear should not be the one speaking for you before he even opens his mouth." Mara said nothing. She placed the notebook beside her thesis and waited for Ruth to fall asleep. Long after the room became quiet, Mara remained awake. She opened the final route and found June's old drawing between the pages. In the picture, Mara wore a red cape and stood behind a large desk. Blue roads connected her office to small houses across the city. The drawing belonged to a life that felt very far away. Mara touched the crayon lines with one finger. She remembered Jonah placing the picture on their refrigerator. She remembered him laughing and asking why she did not have a sword. She could almost hear June answering that her mother did not fight people. She helped them find the way. behind. I'm here. The child looked at the thesis in Mara's lap. Then she reached beneath the bed and pulled out the butterfly can. Mara had hidden it there so it would not be crushed inside the collection bags. June placed the can on top of the thesis. Do not hide your dream in a garbage bag anymore, Mommy. It might think you do not want it. Mara lowered her head. For months, she had tried not to cry in front of June. Her daughter had already seen too many adults lose control. Mara wanted to remain the person who knew what to do next. But June's small hand rested on the blue butterfly, and Mara could no longer hold everything inside. She turned her face away. June moved closer and rested her head against her mother's arm. She did not ask why Mara was crying. She simply stayed there until Mara could breathe normally again. After June fell asleep, Mara placed the butterfly can beside the notebook. She looked at the sentence on the first page, then at Elias's business card, which she had told herself she would throw away. She still did not trust him, but for the first time, she wondered whether Ruth was right. Perhaps she did not have to open the entire door. Perhaps she only had to return to the corner and see whether he was still waiting. Elias could have found Mara within a few hours. Atlas Meridian had security teams, private investigators, and access to more information than most people knew existed. With one phone call, he could have learned which shelters she visited, which recycling centers she used, and where she slept at night. The thought crossed his mind more than once, but he did nothing. Mara had spent months being watched, judged, and used by people who believed their good intentions gave them the right to enter her life. Elias understood that finding her without permission would only prove that he was no different. So each morning, he returned to the same corner with 2 cups of coffee and waited. On the first morning, Mara did not come. On the second, Elias remained there until the sanitation truck emptied the bins. 1 cup went cold in his hand, the other sat untouched on the ledge. By the third morning, the security guard had stopped asking why the founder of Atlas Meridian was standing outside before dawn. Elias did not explain. For most of his life, he had solved problems by moving faster than everyone else. He bought companies before competitors could react, closed deals before doubt had time to grow, and removed obstacles with money or authority. Waiting was new to him. It forced him to accept that Mara had the right to say no. While he waited, Elias began working on a different kind of offer. He called the head of human resources and asked her to establish a new position, Director of Community Health Systems. The role would oversee healthcare access, emergency transportation, and preventive services for Atlas Meridian employees and contract workers. The head of human resources immediately understood that Elias had someone in mind. She warned him that creating a job for one person could damage the company and humiliate the candidate if the truth became known. Elias agreed. The position would not belong to Mara. It would be advertised publicly. A panel of healthcare, transportation, and employee safety experts would evaluate every candidate. Elias would not sit on the panel, and Mara would receive no guarantee that she would be hired. She may never apply, the human resources director said. Then the process continues without her. And if she applies, but is not the strongest candidate, then she does not get the job. The answer surprised her. Elias had spent years making sure that what he wanted became company policy. This time, he wanted Mara to receive something more valuable than a favor. He wanted her to be judged by the work she could still do. He sent the hiring team a copy of the final route without explaining where he had found it. Within a day, 2 panel members asked whether the author was available for an interview. Elias told them only that she might be. On the 4th morning, Samuel Price appeared instead of Mara. He pushed his shopping cart slowly along the sidewalk, stopping several times as if he had forgotten where he was going. When he saw Elias, he stared at the Atlas Meridian logo stitched inside his coat. Samuel pointed toward it. That company used to have another name. Elias looked at him more carefully. Which name? Northline. The word made Elias's body tense. Northline Transit Services was the company named in Mara's thesis, the one connected to delayed emergency response in Rose's neighborhood. Samuel looked toward the tower. His expression changed as old memories moved through him. He had worked as an emergency medical technician for more than 20 years. His memory now failed him in small pieces, but certain nights had never left. "I was there when Rose Ward called for help," he said. Elias stopped breathing. Samuel did not know who Elias was. He spoke slowly, trying to arrange the past in the correct order. He remembered a teenage boy making repeated calls. He remembered an ambulance being redirected because another neighborhood had a higher response priority. He remembered reaching the hospital too late and seeing the boy outside the emergency room holding a pair of tiny white shoes. Elias's voice became quiet. "I was that boy." Samuel looked at him for a long time. Then his eyes filled with recognition and shame. "I should have said something back then. You were not the one who sent the ambulance away." "No, but I heard the recording." Samuel explained that dispatch calls were recorded on magnetic tapes at the time. After Rose's death, supervisors ordered the staff to label the delay as an unavoidable shortage. Samuel knew that was not true. The ambulance had been available. It had been redirected because Northline's contract rewarded faster response in wealthier areas. Samuel secretly copied part of the recording. He had kept it for years, first inside a desk, then in a box after retirement. When he lost his apartment, he placed his most important papers and recordings in a storage unit paid for by a former coworker. Elias asked why he had never released it. Samuel looked down at his cart. "I had a wife, 2 children, and a mortgage. They told me I would lose all of it if I spoke." He gave a tired laugh. "I stayed quiet to protect my home. I lost it anyway." The words remained between them. Then Samuel mentioned Jonah. Months after Jonah's accident, Samuel had been sleeping near the freight yard where Red Harbor Logistics stored its damaged trucks. One evening, he saw 2 men removing boxes of documents from an office scheduled to be closed. He recognized one of them as a security employee connected to Calvin Rusk. The men spoke with a former dispatcher who had copies of driver logs from the night Jonah died. Samuel heard them offer money for the papers. When the dispatcher refused, they warned him that no trucking company would hire him again. Samuel had not understood the importance of the conversation until Mara later showed him Jonah's photograph. By then, the dispatcher had disappeared from the neighborhood. "Calvin's people were cleaning up more than one accident," Samuel said. "Rose's call and Jonah's crash came from the same kind of lie. Move faster, spend less, hide what happens afterward." Elias felt the full weight of the connection. Rose had died because a company valued one neighborhood more than another. Jonah had died because a contractor valued delivery speed more than a tired driver's life. Calvin had protected both systems, and Elias had built an empire around the results. Samuel reached into his coat and removed a small key attached to a faded plastic tag. "The recording is still in storage," he said, "if my memory is right." Elias did not take the key immediately. "Why give it to me now?" Samuel looked toward the corner where Mara usually worked. "Because the map teacher still believes people can be brought home. I think she deserves the truth about why her husband never made it back." Elias closed his hand around the key. For 4 mornings, he had waited for Mara because he wanted to offer her a fair chance. Now Samuel had placed something else in his hand, proof that the losses of 2 families were not separate accidents. They were part of the same system. Elias looked at the untouched coffee on the ledge. Mara had still not returned, but the work ahead of him had become clear. If she came back, he could no longer offer only an interview. He would also have to offer the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything he had built. After 3 days, Mara returned to the corner outside Atlas Meridian Tower. She arrived shortly after 5, when the street was still quiet and most of the offices above remained dark. This time, she carried none of the large bags she used for collecting cans. Her thesis was pressed against her chest, and June's butterfly can rested inside a small cloth bag hanging from her wrist. Mara had spent the entire walk fighting the urge to turn back, but Ruth's words remained in her mind. She did not need to trust Elias yet. She only needed to see what was waiting on the other side of the door. Elias was already standing beside the recycling bins with 2 cups of coffee. The tired look on his face suggested that this was not the first morning he had waited there. When he saw Mara, he lifted 1 cup but did not approach her. He allowed the space between them to remain hers. Mara walked closer and accepted the coffee, though she did not drink it. She looked at the tower behind him, then at the thesis in her arms, as if comparing the life she once had with the life that had brought her back to this sidewalk. "I am not here to pull you out of anything. I want to place a door in front of you and allow you to decide whether to walk through it. Doors built by wealthy men often close as soon as the cameras disappear. There are no cameras. There will be no article, and I cannot promise that you will be hired." "Then what exactly are you offering me?" "A fair evaluation. Something you should have received a long time ago." Elias explained that Atlas Meridian was creating a position for a director of community health systems. The person selected would design programs connecting employees and contract workers with preventive care, emergency transportation, and local medical services. The job would be advertised publicly, and Mara would be evaluated by an independent panel of healthcare and transportation experts. Elias would not control the final decision. Mara would compete against candidates with recent corporate experience, strong connections, and uninterrupted resumes. She would receive no special treatment and no guarantee beyond the chance to present her work. The offer unsettled Mara because it was not the kind of offer she had expected. She had prepared herself for pity, a private check, or a position created only to make Elias feel generous. Instead, he was asking her to stand before a professional panel and prove that the knowledge she carried still had value. Part of her wanted to believe this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Another part remembered every person who had offered help and later demanded gratitude, silence, or control in return. She looked down at the butterfly can and thought of June sleeping in the shelter, still believing there was a desk somewhere in her mother's future. Mara agreed to attend the interview, but only under 3 conditions. Her homelessness, the shelter, and the image of her collecting cans could never be used in company publicity. She would not become the center of a campaign about a billionaire rescuing a struggling mother. Any housing assistance offered during the hiring process had to remain separate from the job and could not be treated as payment for loyalty or gratitude. Most importantly, she demanded the right to ask questions about Jonah's accident and receive honest answers about the company connected to the truck. Elias accepted the first 2 conditions without hesitation. The final one carried a weight Mara could see in his expression. He had already learned that the truck belonged to a subcontractor connected to Atlas Meridian and that safety documents had been changed. He knew the full truth might expose the company to investigations, lawsuits, and public anger. It could end his leadership and destroy the empire he had spent most of his life building. Even so, he accepted her condition. Mara studied him closely. She had come expecting to find another powerful man protecting his own interests. Instead, she saw someone who appeared afraid of what the truth might cost, but more afraid of hiding it again. That did not make her trust him, and it did not reduce the anger she felt over Jonah's death. It only convinced her that returning had not been a mistake. Elias handed her a plain envelope containing the interview date, the position description, and the names of the panel members. There were no publicity forms, no photographer, and no request for her personal story. Mara placed the envelope between the pages of her thesis. Then she removed the butterfly can from the cloth bag and looked at the uneven blue wings June had painted. The small object had survived the car, the shelter, the collection routes, and every morning Mara had nearly stopped believing in herself. She lifted the coffee and took a slow sip before turning away from the tower. Elias remained on the sidewalk while she walked toward the shelter. Neither of them knew whether she would win the position. Neither knew whether Atlas Meridian would survive the truth about Jonah's accident. But for the first time in nearly 2 years, Mara was no longer walking toward another recycling route. She was walking toward an interview, and toward the truth that might change both of their lives. The night before the interview, Mara spread the borrowed navy blazer across her shelter bed. It belonged to Ruth and had not been worn in years. The shoulders were too wide, the sleeves covered half of Mara's hands, and one button was missing. Ruth sat beneath the weak ceiling light with a sewing kit balanced on her lap. Her fingers were stiff from age and illness, but she worked slowly, folding the fabric and tightening each stitch until the jacket began to fit. Around them, the shelter settled into its usual nighttime sounds. Children whispered behind thin walls, water moved through old pipes, and someone pushed a laundry cart down the hallway. Mara watched Ruth sew and felt guilty. The jacket was one of the few good things Ruth still owned. Ruth had once worn it to parent meetings and school ceremonies during her years as a teacher. Now, she was altering it for a woman she had known only a few months. Another shelter resident, Denise, brought over a pair of black shoes. They were slightly worn at the heels but clean and polished. Denise had kept them for job interviews of her own, though none had led to steady work. She placed them beside Mara's bed without making the moment feel like charity. The shoes were simply something useful being passed from one woman to another. Samuel arrived before the shelter doors closed for the night. He carried a small wooden box wrapped in an old handkerchief. Inside was a fountain pen with scratches along the metal clip. He had used it when he worked as an emergency medical technician, signing patient forms after long shifts and writing down names he was afraid the system would forget. It was one of the few objects from his old life that had survived the years. Mara tried to refuse it, but Samuel placed the box beside her thesis. He wanted the pen to enter a room he never would. He wanted something that had once recorded emergencies to help write the beginning of a different future. Mara looked around at the people helping her prepare. None of them had much. Ruth lived from one shelter deadline to the next. Denise counted every dollar before buying food. Samuel carried most of his belongings in a shopping cart. Yet each of them had found something to give. Their help did not make Mara feel small. It reminded her that people who had lost nearly everything were still capable of lifting one another. Ruth finished the final stitch close to midnight. Mara tried on the blazer and stood in front of the small mirror near the bathroom door. The fabric was still a little loose, but it no longer looked borrowed. For the first time in a long while, Mara saw something familiar in her reflection. She did not see the woman bending over recycling bins before sunrise. She saw the person who had once stood before city officials and defended families no one else wanted to notice. The image lasted only a few seconds. Then fear returned. Mara had been rejected too many times to believe a good outfit could change anything. The panel might look at the gap in her resume and decide her life was too unstable. They might admire her research, but choose someone with recent corporate experience. They might see the shelter address on her paperwork and begin questioning everything except her ability. She placed her thesis, Samuel's pen, and the interview documents inside her bag. Then she lay beside June and stared at the ceiling until morning. Before sunrise, Ruth helped Mara smooth the blazer one final time. Denise cleaned a small mark from the borrowed shoes. Samuel waited near the shelter entrance, holding his cart steady with one hand. No one treated the interview as a rescue. They treated it as a place Mara had earned the right to enter. June watched her mother prepare in silence. She had seen the blazer the night before, but that morning she studied Mara as if trying to memorize the moment. Then she reached beneath her pillow and took out the butterfly can. The blue paint had chipped along one wing. Mara had carried it through cold streets, crowded buses, and recycling centers. It was no longer perfect, but June still handled it carefully. She placed it inside Mara's bag beside the thesis. When you feel afraid, Hold it. A butterfly does not know how high it will fly. It only knows that it has to open its wings. Mara pulled June close and held her longer than usual. The child's arms tightened around her neck. For a moment, Mara wanted to stay there. The shelter was uncomfortable and uncertain, but it was familiar. The interview waiting across the city could lead to another rejection, another disappointment, and another reason for June to watch her mother pretend not to be hurt. Then Mara felt the butterfly compressing against the side of the bag. She left the shelter. The walk to Atlas Meridian Tower felt different without collection bags over her shoulders. Mara passed the same blocks she had studied for months, but she did not stop at the recycling bins. She crossed streets where people had once stepped around her and continued toward the tower in the borrowed shoes. When the building came into view, she slowed down. For many mornings, Mara had known Atlas Meridian only from the outside. She had seen its lights turn on while she sorted cans in the dark. She had watched employees enter carrying laptops and coffee while she worked beside the bins. The glass doors had always seemed to divide two different worlds. Now those doors opened for her. The lobby was bright and quiet. Mara stepped inside and felt the warmth against her face. Polished floors reflected the ceiling lights, and a large Atlas Meridian logo covered the wall behind the security desk. Several employees walked past without recognizing her. No one knew that the woman wearing the navy blazer had once collected their discarded cans before dawn. The security guard asked for her name. Mara gave it clearly. He checked the visitor list, printed a badge, and placed it on the desk. "They are waiting for you on the 30th floor." Mara attached the badge to her blazer. Her name looked strange, printed beneath the Atlas Meridian logo. She turned toward the glass entrance and saw the corner across the street. The recycling bins stood where they always had. The stone ledge still held a faint coffee stain from one of Elias's cups. For a second, Mara remembered kneeling in the rain while her thesis slid toward a puddle. She remembered the torn bag, the cans rolling into traffic, and the feeling that her old life had become something she had to protect from the street. Her hand moved toward the bag. Inside, her fingers touched the butterfly can. Mara turned away from the window and walked toward the elevators. She pressed the button for the 30th floor and waited as the doors closed around her. The numbers began to rise. For the first time, Mara was not looking up at the tower from the sidewalk. She was inside it. The interview panel consisted of 5 people from healthcare, transportation, finance, and employee safety. Elias was not among them. Mara noticed that immediately. It meant the promise of a fair evaluation had been kept, at least for that morning. She placed her thesis on the table, opened her notes, and began with the problem. Atlas Meridian employed thousands of people across warehouses, distribution centers, and freight terminals. Many worked long shifts, changed schedules without warning, or lived far from affordable medical care. Workers often delayed treatment until a small illness became an emergency. Pregnant employees missed appointments. Drivers ignored pain because they feared losing hours. Others carried stress, grief, or depression until they could no longer work safely. Mara proposed placing trained community health specialists inside the company's largest facilities. They would not replace doctors. Their job would be to help workers find medication, schedule appointments, arrange transportation, understand insurance, and reach mental health support before a crisis began. The same system could serve contract workers who were often excluded from company benefits even though they faced many of the same risks. The panel challenged every part of the plan. They questioned the cost, the legal risk, and whether employees would trust the program. They asked how Mara would protect medical privacy and how she would measure success. One member suggested that the company could simply hire an outside consulting firm instead of creating an internal department. Mara did not become defensive. She used Atlas Meridian's own numbers. Emergency room visits were highest at facilities with the longest shifts. Absence rates increased in areas where workers had to travel farther for care. Several warehouse injuries had happened after employees continued working while sick or exhausted. The company was already paying for the problem through hospital claims, lost workdays, accidents, and high turnover. It simply paid after people were hurt instead of before. She showed that a pilot program in 3 major facilities could reduce emergency costs within the first year. More important, it could reach thousands of workers who had learned to ignore their health until they had no choice. Mara did not ask the panel to feel sorry for them. She showed why helping them was practical, responsible, and less expensive than continuing to look away. No one asked where she lived. No one asked why there was a gap in her resume. For the first time in 2 years, Mara was judged only by what she knew. When the interview ended, the head of the panel thanked her and collected the evaluation forms. The members left the room one by one, carrying copies of her proposal. Mara remained seated, her hands resting beside Samuel's fountain pen. She did not know whether she had won the position, but she knew she had proved something to herself. The woman who once stood before city officials had not disappeared. She had only been buried beneath grief, fear, and survival. Then Elias entered the room carrying a gray folder. Mara knew from his expression that the real interview was not over. He sat across from her and placed the folder between them. Inside were copies of driver logs, safety reports, emails, and documents connected to Jonah's accident. Elias explained that the freight truck belonged to a subcontractor working under Atlas Meridian. The driver had been pushed far beyond legal hours. Warnings had been deleted, signatures had been forged, and Calvin had helped hide the records after Jonah died. Mara read the first page, then the second. Her breathing changed as the truth became clear. Jonah's death had not been caused only by rain or one exhausted driver. People had known the risk. They had seen the warnings and chosen faster deliveries over human lives. For 2 years, Mara had blamed herself for not noticing how tired Jonah had been that night. She had blamed the hospital, the truck driver, and the cruel randomness of bad timing. Now, she understood that the accident had been built slowly through many decisions made by people who never saw Jonah's face. Her hands tightened around the folder. "Did you invite me here because of my abilities, or because you wanted to purchase forgiveness? I have no right to purchase that. If I accept this position, people will say you paid me to remain silent. Then do not remain silent. Tell the entire truth, including the part that may cost me this chair." Mara looked at Elias for a long time. His answer did not reduce her anger. It did not return Jonah or erase the nights June had waited for him. It did not change the fact that Atlas Meridian had earned money from a system that destroyed their family. She closed the folder. The job had seemed like a road out of the shelter. It could give June a home, a bedroom, and a school that did not change. It could return Mara to work that mattered. But accepting it at that moment felt impossible. She could not separate the opportunity from the truth placed in front of her. Mara removed the visitor badge from her blazer and set it on the table. Then she placed June's butterfly can beside it for a moment. The chipped blue wings reminded her why she had come. She had wanted to prove that she could still stand in a room like this. She had done that. She did not need to decide the rest while her heart was breaking. Mara returned the can to her bag, picked up the folder, and walked toward the door. Elias did not try to stop her. He understood that asking her to stay would turn the offer into another form of pressure. If the job was truly based on her ability, it would still exist after she had time to face the truth. If the company intended to take responsibility, it would do so whether Mara accepted the position or never entered the building again. The elevator carried her back toward the lobby. As the numbers dropped, Mara held the folder against her chest beside the thesis. One contained the work she had built to save lives. The other contained the decisions that had taken Jonah's life. When the doors opened, she stepped into the lobby and walked past the security desk. Through the glass, she could see the corner where she had once collected cans. That morning, she had entered the tower believing the hardest question would be whether she was still good enough. She left knowing the harder question was whether a future built inside Atlas Meridian could ever be separated from the past it had hidden. The emergency board meeting began less than an hour after Mara left the building. Every member had received copies of the hidden safety reports, the altered driver logs, and Calvin's emails. No one questioned whether the documents were serious. Their only concern was when the truth should be revealed. Atlas Meridian was days away from completing the largest merger in its history. If the evidence became public before the agreement was signed, investors could withdraw, lenders could freeze funding, and the company's stock price could collapse. Several board members warned that thousands of employees might lose their jobs because of crimes committed by a small group of executives years earlier. They argued that the responsible decision was to delay disclosure until the merger was complete. Elias listened as they described silence as protection. For most of his career, he might have agreed with them. He had often defended difficult decisions by claiming that the company's survival came first. That same thinking had allowed unsafe contracts to continue, exhausted drivers to remain on the road, and warning reports to disappear beneath profitable numbers. This time, Elias understood what delay truly meant. It meant allowing the company to grow stronger while the families it had harmed remained in the dark. The board warned him that releasing the evidence could end his leadership. Some members were prepared to remove him immediately if he acted without their approval. Others reminded him that he had not personally ordered the records to be falsified. Calvin was gone, the subcontractor no longer existed, and many of the employees involved had left the company. Elias could protect Atlas Meridian by placing the blame on people who were no longer there to defend themselves. He refused to do that. Jonah's death had not come from one bad decision. It had come from a system that rewarded speed, ignored exhaustion, and treated human safety as a cost that could be reduced. Elias had signed the contracts, praised the profits, and accepted Calvin's reports without asking what had been hidden behind them. He could not claim innocence simply because someone else had carried out the deception. The meeting continued for hours. The board discussed lawsuits, criminal exposure, and the possibility that Elias could lose everything he had built. He looked around the table and realized that no one mentioned Rose, Jonah, or the drivers who had been pushed beyond their limits. The dead appeared only as legal risk. Before the board could vote, Samuel arrived at the building. He wore the same worn coat Elias had seen on the sidewalk and carried a small metal case beneath one arm. Security initially refused to allow him upstairs, but Elias personally ordered that he be brought into the meeting. Samuel entered the boardroom slowly, leaning on his cart for support. Several directors looked uncomfortable when they saw him, as though poverty itself had entered a room designed to keep it outside. Inside the case was the original recording from the night Rose called for an ambulance. Samuel had preserved it through every move, every unpaid bill, and every year of homelessness. He also carried copies of driver safety reports connected to Red Harbor Logistics. Calvin's employees had tried to obtain those documents after Jonah's accident, but Samuel had hidden duplicates before the originals disappeared. The room became silent as the recording played. A teenage boy's frightened voice asked when help would arrive. A dispatcher assured him that an ambulance was on the way. In the background, another supervisor ordered the available unit redirected toward a wealthier district with a more valuable contract. Elias heard his own younger voice calling Rose's name. He had spent decades trying to forget that sound, but Samuel had carried it all those years. When the recording ended, Samuel kept his eyes on the table. He admitted that he had remained silent because supervisors threatened his job and pension. At the time, he had a wife, children, and a mortgage. He believed protecting them required him to stay quiet. Later, when he finally wanted to speak, the company had changed names, the records had disappeared, and most people no longer cared. I carried the truth in my pocket for 20 years. It weighed more than anything I ever carried on the street. Elias placed his hand on the metal case. Then, today, we put it on the table. The evidence ended the debate. Elias ordered every record copied and delivered to federal investigators, city authorities, and an independent legal team. He informed the board that he would hold a press conference that afternoon. If they wanted to remove him before then, they could try. He would still speak as the founder of Atlas Meridian and as the man whose signature had allowed the system to continue. The press conference was held in the company lobby. Reporters filled the room while employees watched from the balconies above. Elias stood alone at the podium. There were no company banners behind him and no prepared video designed to soften the announcement. He revealed the falsified driver logs, deleted safety reports, and pressure placed on subcontractors to meet impossible schedules. He confirmed that Atlas Meridian had benefited financially from those practices. He acknowledged that company leaders had hidden evidence after Jonah's death and that similar decisions had affected emergency transportation years earlier. Elias announced that all records had been transferred to investigators. He temporarily resigned as chairman and surrendered control of the internal review to an independent committee. He also asked the board to delay the merger until the full scope of the misconduct was known. Reporters demanded to know why he had chosen to speak now. Elias did not mention Mara. He did not describe the woman collecting cans outside his tower or the thesis that had brought Rose's name back to him. He refused to use Mara's suffering as proof that he had changed. Her pain did not belong in his defense. He accepted responsibility without asking anyone to praise him for it. At the shelter, Mara watched the press conference on a small television in the common room. Ruth sat nearby, while June leaned against her mother's side. Other residents gathered around as the news showed images of investigators entering Atlas Meridian Tower. Mara expected Elias to mention her. She expected the reporter-friendly story of a billionaire inspired by a homeless woman. He never did. He spoke about the victims, the workers, and the company's failure, but he protected her name. That choice mattered. It did not erase Jonah's death. It did not restore the home June had lost or remove the years of grief Mara still carried. Elias's confession could not make him innocent. But he had been given the chance to protect his company and had chosen the truth instead. June watched Elias step away from the podium. "Is he a good man?" Mara looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. "A good person is not someone who has never done wrong. It is someone who refuses to keep walking after discovering that another person has been hurt." On the television, Elias left the building surrounded by reporters. For the first time, he was walking away from the empire he had spent his life building. Mara understood that he had not done it to save her. He had done it because the truth had finally become more important than survival. 1 week after Elias's press conference, a white envelope arrived at the shelter with Mara's name printed across the front. There was no Atlas Meridian logo on it, only the name of the independent recruitment firm that had managed the interviews. Mara carried the envelope to the edge of her bed, but did not open it immediately. She had spent the entire week telling herself that the interview had already given her something important. She had stood before professionals, defended her work, and proved that the years of collecting cans had not taken away her ability. Still, her hands shook as she slid one finger beneath the seal. The letter was 3 pages long. The first page informed her that she had ranked first among all candidates and was being offered the position of Director of Community Health Systems. The panel praised her research, her understanding of transportation barriers, and her ability to connect healthcare outcomes with the company's operating data. It described her proposal as practical, measurable, and capable of improving thousands of lives. Nowhere did the letter mention the shelter, the cans, Jonah's death, or Elias finding her on the sidewalk. Mara read it twice before she allowed herself to breathe. She had expected at least one sentence about resilience or overcoming hardship. Employers often used those words when they wanted to praise someone's suffering without recognizing their skill. This letter did not call her brave. It called her qualified. It did not say Atlas Meridian wanted to give her a second chance. It said she had earned the highest evaluation score. Ruth sat beside her while June leaned against Mara's shoulder, trying to read words that were still too difficult for her. Samuel stood near the doorway holding his shopping cart. No one celebrated loudly at first. They understood how long Mara had waited to see her name on a document that did not define her by what she had lost. She pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. June reached for the first page and pointed to the job title. She did not understand every word, but she recognized that her mother was being asked to work in an office again. The child ran to the bed, pulled out the butterfly can, and placed it beside the letter. The blue paint had chipped even more, but Mara had never seen it look more beautiful. The offer included temporary housing support for Mara and June while she began the position. It was presented as part of a company-wide relocation and stabilization policy, not as a personal favor. Mara appreciated the care behind the decision, but she did not sign the contract immediately. The same company offering her a future had also hidden the choices that destroyed her family. Before she accepted anything, she needed to know whether Atlas Meridian intended to change its system or merely improve its public image. Mara sent the board 4 conditions. The new health program had to serve contract workers as well as permanent employees. Many of the exhausted drivers and warehouse workers most at risk were not directly employed by Atlas Meridian, and excluding them would repeat the same failure that had taken Jonah's life. The company also needed an independent safety reporting system that allowed workers to report dangerous schedules without fear of losing their jobs. Her third condition required the company to create a relief fund for families harmed by past safety violations. The fund would be supported by bonuses recovered from executives and managers found responsible for misconduct. Mara refused to let ordinary employees pay for decisions made by people at the top. Her final condition was that the program's results, failures, and safety data had to be published. She would not allow Atlas Meridian to hide bad numbers or use a few success stories as a publicity campaign. Several board members resisted. The conditions would cost money, expose the company to further criticism, and give contract workers access to services they had never received before. But after Elias's resignation and the public investigation, the board could no longer pretend that the old way of doing business was sustainable. The independent panel supported Mara's proposal, and employee groups began demanding similar changes. 3 days later, the board accepted every condition. Mara signed the contract at the same shelter table where she had once planned collection routes in June's notebook. She used Samuel's fountain pen. The ink paused briefly at the beginning of her name, and Mara remembered how many forms she had filled out after Jonah died. Those forms had asked her to prove her poverty, her debt, and her loss. This document asked only whether she was willing to lead. On her first day, Mara entered Atlas Meridian Tower wearing the navy blazer Ruth had altered. This time, the visitor badge had been replaced by an employee identification card. She rode the elevator to the 30th floor and was shown to a quiet office with a desk, 2 chairs, and a large blank wall where her team would later place maps and program data. Mara set her thesis in the center of the desk. The clear cover still carried a faint mark from the puddle where Elias had first seen it. She did not replace the binder. The damage was part of the journey now. Beside the thesis, she placed June's butterfly can. For several seconds, Mara stood without moving. She remembered the first page of June's notebook and the uneven sentence written there. "Mommy will have a desk again." At the time, Mara had continued writing beneath it because she could not afford to believe the words. Now, her hand rested on the desk they had promised. Elias stood outside the open office. He was no longer acting chairman and had no authority over Mara's department. The investigations into Atlas Meridian were still continuing, and he did not know whether he would ever return to leadership. He had come only to see the beginning of the program that might become more important than anything he had built before it. "Does the room fit you?" Mara looked around the office, then toward the glass wall separating it from the hallway. Employees passed outside, including drivers, assistants, and contract workers who did not yet know that the new department had been created for them. "I do not need the room to fit me. I need it to be large enough for everyone who has never been allowed inside." Elias lowered his head and left her to begin. Mara opened June's notebook and placed it beside the company data. The old collection routes were still there, filled with times, weights, and payments that had never been enough. She turned to a clean page and began drawing a new map. This time, the lines did not lead to recycling centers. They led to clinics, warehouses, homes, and people who had waited too long for someone to notice them. 1 year later, the first mobile medical units began moving through Philadelphia under Mara's direction. The vehicles traveled between Atlas Meridian warehouses, neighborhood clinics, hospitals, and communities where many families had once struggled to reach basic care. Each unit carried trained health workers who helped people schedule appointments, understand medication, find mental health support, and arrange transportation before a small problem became an emergency. Workers no longer had to choose between losing a shift and visiting a doctor. Pregnant employees could receive early checkups near their workplaces, while women living nearby were also allowed to use the service. The program started with 3 vehicles and quickly expanded. Several Atlas Meridian drivers volunteered for emergency response training. They had spent years transporting packages, machinery, and commercial goods across the country. Now they learned how to recognize medical danger, communicate with emergency teams, and help patients reach care safely. No driver replaced an ambulance, but they became part of a larger network designed to prevent people from being forgotten while waiting for one. Within the first year, emergency hospital admissions among employees began to fall. Workers received treatment earlier. Warehouse accidents caused by exhaustion decreased, and pregnant women missed fewer medical appointments. The company saved money, but Mara refused to let savings become the program's main story. The numbers that mattered most were the people who returned home safely, the mothers who received help before complications became serious, and the families who never had to make desperate calls that went unanswered. The independent safety system also began exposing problems that had once remained hidden. Drivers reported impossible schedules without fearing dismissal. Contract workers received the same access to support as permanent employees. Families harmed by past company decisions received assistance from the relief fund Mara had required. The changes did not erase the damage Atlas Meridian had caused, but they prevented silence from protecting the same mistakes again. Mara understood that no system could promise that tragedy would never happen. What it could do was refuse to ignore warnings, refuse to place profit above exhaustion, and refuse to decide that one neighborhood mattered less than another. That was the purpose of the final route. It was no longer only a thesis protected inside a torn bag. It had become a working network carrying help toward people before they were forced to beg for it. During that year, Mara and June moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment. It was not large, and the building was older than Mara would have chosen if money had not mattered. The kitchen cabinets needed repairs, and the living room windows faced another brick building. To June, however, it felt larger than any place she had ever seen. The first time they entered, June ran from room to room. She opened closets, tested every light switch, and pressed both hands against the bedroom window. Then she turned toward Mara with uncertainty. They had moved so many times that the child had learned not to believe too quickly in anything permanent. June asked whether they were camping again. Mara knelt in front of her and held both of her hands. "No, sweetheart, this time we are home." June looked around the room once more before throwing her arms around Mara's neck. That night, she arranged her few books beside the bed and placed her stuffed rabbit on the pillow. Mara found Jonah's tiny collection of belongings still packed inside an old box. Among them were the shoes he had worn during long shifts at the emergency dispatch center. June carried the shoes to a shelf beside the front door. She placed them there carefully, with both toes facing the room. Mara understood what her daughter was doing. Jonah would never walk through that door, but June wanted something of him waiting inside their home. His shoes became part of the apartment, as though he had finally returned with them. A few months later, the largest community medical transportation center opened in Elias's old neighborhood. The building stood only a few blocks from the apartment where Rose had gone into premature labor many years earlier. Mara proposed naming it the Rose Jonah Center. One name honored a young mother who waited too long for an ambulance. The other honored a man killed by a transportation system that had valued speed over safety. The two had never met, but both had been failed by decisions made far from their homes. Their names now stood together, above the entrance of a building created to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. Elias attended the opening ceremony, but remained away from the front row. He was still cooperating with investigators and had not returned to his position as chairman. Atlas Meridian had paid large penalties, several former executives faced criminal charges, and the company was still rebuilding the trust it had lost. Elias no longer spoke about restoring his reputation. He understood that some things could not be repaired through a speech. When he finally stepped onto the stage, he spoke publicly about Rose for the first time. He described the teenage boy who had waited for help and the tiny shoes he had carried home from the hospital. He did not discuss his wealth, the size of Atlas Meridian, or the companies he had built. He spoke only about the promise he had made and how far he had allowed himself to move away from it. I spent 30 years building roads that delivered goods to the correct destination. A woman I met on a sidewalk taught me that the most important road is the one that carries people back to one another. Mara stood beside June as the doors of the Rose Jonah Center opened. The first medical vehicle waited outside, ready to begin its route. Samuel sat near the entrance, wearing a clean jacket provided by the center's community program. Ruth and Denise were there as well. None of them had been treated as guests included for decoration. Mara had made sure they were recognized as people who helped carry her to that day. Early the following morning, Mara returned to the corner outside Atlas Meridian Tower. She no longer carried 3 bags for collecting cans. Instead, she had come to deliver a new recycling container to a community kitchen opening nearby. The street looked much the same as it had when Elias first noticed her, but Mara no longer felt invisible there. As she crossed the sidewalk, she saw a young woman searching through a recycling bin. The woman wore an old jacket and carried a plastic bag over one shoulder. Between each item she collected, she looked at a textbook displayed on a phone with a cracked screen. Mara stopped. She did not take out her own phone or photograph the woman. She did not ask where she slept or why she was collecting cans. She did not offer money before learning anything about her. Mara remembered how often people had looked at her circumstances and never wondered what still lived inside her mind. She walked closer. "What is the book you are reading about?" The young woman looked up in surprise. For a moment, she appeared unsure whether the question was serious. Then she turned the cracked screen toward Mara and began explaining. Someone had finally asked about what screen toward Mara and began explaining. Someone had finally asked about what she was learning instead of what she carried over her shoulder. In the distance, the bell above the entrance of the Rose Jonah Center rang. The first medical vehicle of the morning pulled away from the curb and began its route through the city. It carried no commercial goods and had no profit target to meet. It carried people toward help. High above the street, morning light entered Mara's office. It touched the watermarked cover of her thesis and moved across the small butterfly can beside it. The blue paint was chipped and one wing remained uneven, but Mara had never repaired it. It did not need to be perfect to remind her how far it had traveled. Final message: no human life becomes worthless simply because the world has thrown it aside. Sometimes what a person needs is not someone who feels sorry for their circumstances, but someone patient enough to recognize the extraordinary thing they are still carrying.